The metal gleamed under surgical lights, not the dull gray of a tumor, but the unmistakable shine of brass. Dr. Sarah Caldwell Morgan's gloved hands trembled as the forceps closed around it. "Is that?" her colleague whispered. "A bullet," she confirmed, voice hollow. "In my father's back." 7 more fragments followed, each one a secret, each one 54 years old. In the ICU waiting room, her mother clutched a rusted metal box. Inside, a letter postmarked April 1969. Yellowed envelope, never opened. The return address made Margaret Caldwell's hands shake. Lieutenant David Morrison. The man her husband claimed had shot him, the man who'd threatened him into silence. Dead the day after he'd written it. And James had never broken the seal. For half a century he'd carried the bullet and the lie. But which part was the lie? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. Marietta, Georgia had always been a town where everyone knew your business. The Caldwell house on Oakwood Drive sat modest and unassuming. A single-story ranch with white aluminum siding and black shutters that needed paint. An American flag in a triangular display case hung above the mantel, the kind they gave to widows and families of the fallen. Except James Edward Caldwell hadn't fallen. He'd come home. That was 1970, 53 years ago. The morning light filtered through kitchen curtains, catching dust motes in its beam. Sam Cooke's "You Send Me" played softly on the old radio, the same station Margaret had listened to since 1975. She stood at the stove, 70 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, making cornbread, the way she'd made it every Sunday for 48 years of marriage. James sat at the kitchen table, newspaper spread before him, coffee untouched and going cold. 72 now, tall even when stooped, with those deep-set blue eyes that always seemed to look past people rather than at them. The long-sleeved flannel shirt hung loose on his frame. He'd lost weight this past year, though he'd never admit it. Even in George's October warmth, he never wore short sleeves. Never. Margaret had learned not to ask about that decades ago. Some doors in a marriage stayed closed. She noticed him shift in his chair, subtle but there, a wince. His left hand moved toward his shoulder blade, that unconscious gesture she'd seen more frequently these past months, 3 times this week alone. "Sleep all right?" she asked, not turning from the stove. "Fine," his standard answer. The newspaper rustled as he turned the page. She didn't believe him. Hadn't believed that answer in years. But belief and acceptance were different things in a long marriage. On the counter, the calendar showed today's date circled. Another doctor's appointment. The 3rd he'd rescheduled. She'd stopped mentioning them. "Benjamin's coming by later," she said instead, testing safer waters. "Wants to show you his science project." James's expression softened fractionally. His grandson, Sarah's boy, 12 years old and curious about everything. One of the few people who could pull something resembling joy from James these days. "That's good," he said. Then, quieter, "That's real good." He shifted again. This time the wince was visible. His hand pressed against his back, searching for something he couldn't reach. For just a moment, his face went pale. Margaret saw it, filed it away with all the other things she'd learned to see and not speak about. The nightmares, the way he flinched when planes flew overhead, the locked metal box in the garage he thought she didn't know about. 48 years of marriage to a man who'd brought a war home with him. She'd been an army nurse. She knew the signs. She just hadn't known how literal the war inside him truly was. It happened at 7:15. James pushed back from the breakfast table, the chair legs scraping against linoleum. A simple movement, something he'd done 10,000 mornings before. But this time, halfway to standing, his body locked. The gasp that escaped his lips was sharp, involuntary, animal. Margaret turned from the stove in time to see him catch himself against the table edge, knuckles bone-white around the wood. His face had drained of color, sweat beading instantly across his forehead, despite the cool morning air. "James?" She moved toward him, 40 years of nursing instinct overriding everything else. "I'm fine." The words came through gritted teeth. But he wasn't fine. His right hand reached behind his left shoulder, clawing for something he couldn't touch. The movement was desperate, involuntary. "Let me help you sit. I said I'm fine." He pushed away from the table, trying to stand fully upright. Made it 2 steps toward the garage, his refuge, always his refuge, before his knees buckled. He didn't fall so much as fold, sliding down against the wall until he sat on the kitchen floor, breathing hard. One hand still reaching behind himself, the other braced against the floor. Margaret knelt beside him, her joints protesting, but her hands steady. "James, let me." She reached for his shoulder. He cried out when her fingers made contact. Not loud, but visceral. Pain mixed with something else. Fear. She pulled her hand back and looked at her fingers. They were wet, red. For a moment, the kitchen was absolutely silent except for the radio. Sam Cooke, still singing about love and longing, oblivious to everything. Margaret stared at her hand. Not much blood, but enough. Seeping through his shirt where her fingers had pressed, James saw her face, saw what she'd seen. Something in his expression crumbled, not just pain, but the collapse of a wall he'd maintained for longer than she could calculate. "Don't," he whispered. "Maggie, please, don't." She didn't answer, couldn't. Her mind was already working through possibilities, differentials, things that made people bleed through their clothes without knowing it. Nothing good came to mind. "How long?" Her voice was steadier than she felt. Nurse voice, the one that had gotten her through field hospitals and veterans' wards and 40 years of watching men fall apart in silence. He closed his eyes. "James, how long has this been happening? I need to get to the garage." An evasion, a retreat. "You're bleeding through your shirt. You can't even stand up." "You're not going anywhere until I see what's happening." "It's nothing. Just James Edward Caldwell." His full name. She only used it when she meant business. "I have been a nurse longer than you've been lying to me about this. Let me see it, or I'm calling an ambulance right now." They stared at each other. A standoff in their own kitchen, over cornbread and cold coffee, and whatever secret had been living under his clothes for God knew how long. Finally he nodded, once, still wouldn't look at her. She helped him to the bedroom. He moved like an old man, which he was, but older still. Something in him had shifted, surrendered. In their bedroom the morning light was softer. She closed the door, though they were alone. Some habits of privacy ran too deep. "Sit on the edge of the bed." He obeyed. She moved behind him, hands reaching for the hem of his flannel shirt. He flinched, but didn't stop her. After 48 years of marriage, this was the first time she'd done this. The first time he'd let her. The shirt lifted. Margaret had seen wounds, had seen them fresh in field hospitals, had seen them decades old in veterans' homes, had seen things that would give civilians nightmares. She'd thought nothing could shock her anymore. She was wrong. The mass on his left shoulder blade, was the size of a softball, maybe larger. The skin stretched over it was thin, purplish red, shot through with distended veins that looked ready to burst. At the center, the skin had broken down completely, a small area weeping clear fluid mixed with blood. The tissue around it was bruised, hot to the touch, even from inches away. This wasn't something that appeared overnight. This was weeks, months, maybe years of growth. "James." Her voice came from very far away. "How long?" Silence stretched. Then, barely audible, 20 years. Maybe more. Her hand shook as she reached for her phone. Sarah's number was still in her contacts, though they hadn't spoken in nearly 3 years. Mother and daughter, estranged over things too complicated to untangle. But Sarah was a surgeon, the best oncology surgeon at Emory University Hospital, and this, whatever this was, needed the best. Sarah answered on the third ring, voice guarded. "Mom? It's your father." Margaret's voice finally cracked. "You need to come. Now." Sarah Caldwell Morgan made the drive from Atlanta to Marietta in 25 minutes. The speed limit suggested 40. She didn't care. Her hands gripped the steering wheel too tight, knuckles white, the same way they'd been white against 100 surgical instruments in 100 operating rooms. But this was different. This was the call she'd been half expecting and wholly dreading for 10 years. The last real conversation with her father had been a decade ago. The last visit, 3 years back. She'd stayed 20 minutes, made excuses about Benjamin's soccer game, and left. She'd told herself she didn't care anymore. Told herself the distance was mutual, was earned, was necessary. Her racing heartbeat said otherwise. The Caldwell house looked smaller than she remembered. Or maybe she'd just grown used to bigger things. Bigger hospital, bigger house in Atlanta, bigger life that didn't include the man who'd missed her wedding, missed Benjamin's birth by choice, not chance, missed everything that mattered because he couldn't get past whatever wall he'd built between himself and the living. Margaret met her at the door. Her mother looked older. When had that happened? The lines around her eyes were deeper, her hair more silver than brown. Sarah realized with a sick twist that she hadn't really looked at her mother in years, hadn't let herself. They embraced briefly. No words. What was there to say? "He's in the bedroom," Margaret said simply. Sarah grabbed her medical bag from the trunk. She always kept one, old habit from residency that had never faded. Inside the house, the smell hit her. Cornbread, coffee, and underneath it, something else. Something antiseptic. Her mother had been cleaning wounds. The bedroom door was half open. James lay on his side, facing the wall, his back to the door. He'd aged too, more than she'd expected. His hair was completely silver now, his frame thinner. She could count his ribs through the undershirt he wore. "Dad?" He didn't turn. "Don't need you here." The words stung less than they should have. She'd built immunity over time. "Mom called, so I'm here. Let me look." "Nothing to look at." "You're bleeding through your shirt. That's something." "I'm fine." Sarah felt the old frustration rise, that familiar knot in her chest. 10 years of silence, and they fell right back into this. "If you were fine, I wouldn't be here. Now you can let me examine you, or I can call an ambulance. Your choice." Silence. Then Margaret's voice, steel underneath the softness. "James Edward Caldwell, you let her look, or I'm making the call myself." The use of his full name did what Sarah's medical authority couldn't. He nodded once, still facing away. Sarah pulled on gloves from her bag. Professional distance. That's what they'd taught her in medical school. Treat every patient the same. She'd never been good at it, but she tried now. Tried to see him as just another case, just another body with just another problem. Margaret helped lift his shirt. Sarah's clinical expression cracked. She'd done her oncology fellowship at MD Anderson, had seen tumors the size of grapefruits, had removed masses that had eaten through bone and muscle and everything human. She thought she'd seen the spectrum. This was different. This was her father. The mass dominated his left shoulder blade and upper back. The skin stretched over it was almost translucent, the purple-red color of something about to rupture. Veins spider-webbed across the surface, engorged and angry. At the center, a small area of breakdown wept fluid. Her physician training kicked in. Hands that had trembled a moment before steadied. She took out her phone, used the flashlight function to examine from multiple angles, took photos. James flinched at the camera sound, but didn't protest. She palpated gently. The mass was firm, non-mobile, warm to touch. James's jaw clenched, but he made no sound. Large subcutaneous mass, she said, falling into clinical language because it was safer than feeling. Appears encapsulated. Extensive vascularization. Recent trauma to overlying skin. Margaret stood behind her, arms wrapped around herself. In English? Big tumor with its own blood supply. Skin starting to break down. Sarah looked at her father's profile. He still wouldn't meet her eyes. Dad, how long have you had this? Silence. I need to know. For treatment. Long time. His voice was barely audible. Define long time. Since you were little. Sarah's mind raced through calculations. She was 44. How little? Grade school. The room tilted. 35 years minimum. Possibly 40. He'd been walking around with this thing growing on his back for 40 years and said nothing. To no one. Not even the woman who'd slept beside him every night. 40 years? The words came out louder than she intended. 40 years? You've had a mass growing on your back for 40 years and said nothing? Sarah, don't! She stood abruptly, professional composure shattering. Just don't. She stepped into the hallway, pulling out her phone. Her hands were shaking again. She dialed a colleague at Emory, voice clipped and professional. Tom, it's Sarah Caldwell. I need an emergency favor. CT scan, today, if possible. Yes, today. I'll explain when I get there. When she returned to the bedroom, her voice was cold, clinical. Get dressed. We're going to Atlanta. You need imaging. I've lived with it this long. You're bleeding through your skin, Dad. That's your body saying it can't anymore. She met his eyes finally, held them. Please. It was the please that did it. After a long moment, he nodded. The drive to Emory University Hospital took 45 minutes through Atlanta traffic. Sarah drove, James in the passenger seat, Margaret in back. The first time in 10 years they'd been in a car together. The silence was heavy enough to suffocate. Halfway there, James spoke. Benjamin, he's doing well? Sarah glanced at him, surprised. You know about Benjamin? Your mother sends pictures. Sarah's grip tightened on the wheel. She hadn't known that. Her son was 12, and apparently her parents had been keeping track through photographs while she'd been keeping distance through pride. He's good. Smart, asks too many questions. Good trait in a kid. Sometimes. She paused at a red light. He asks about you sometimes. James turned slightly, the first time he'd really looked at her. What do you tell him? That you're busy. That you live far away. The light changed. She accelerated. That some people are hard to know. The words hung there, true in more ways than one. There's things you need to know, James said quietly, before they what? Just things about the war. Sarah's throat tightened. He'd never talked about Vietnam, never, not once in 44 years of being her father. We'll talk after the scan. She didn't realize those would be the last normal words they'd exchange. Emery's radiology department smelled like every hospital, antiseptic and anxiety. Sarah had pulled strings to get them in immediately. The technician recognized her, treated James with extra care because he was Dr. Caldwell Morgan's father. James changed into a hospital gown. The thin paper exposed what he'd hidden for decades. Margaret saw the full extent for the first time, the mass visible even from the front, distorting his entire left shoulder. The CT scan took 15 minutes. James lay face down on the table while the machine hummed and whirred, taking hundreds of cross-sectional images. 15 minutes that felt like hours. Afterward, Sarah had the images rushed to the reading room, usually a 24-hour wait. Her colleague, Dr. Tom Whitfield, reviewed them immediately. Sarah and Margaret stood in Tom's office while James dressed. The computer screen glowed with grayscale images of her father's interior. Tom clicked through them slowly, his expression changing with each slice. He paused on one image, zoomed in. Sarah, are you seeing this? The mass was enormous on screen. 35 centimeters in diameter, with its own elaborate vascular system branching off the subclavian artery. It appeared encapsulated, likely a mature cystic teratoma based on the imaging characteristics. Benign, usually. But this size, this location, this duration, nothing about it was usual. But that wasn't what made Tom pause. He switched the viewing window to bone and metal settings. At the center of the mass, a small white object appeared, dense, metallic. The shape was unmistakable, elongated, pointed at one end. Is that what I think it is? Tom asked quietly. Sarah leaned closer, her medical training warring with daughter instinct. It looks like... Margaret stepped up behind them. What? What is it? There's something metallic inside, Sarah said, turning to her mother, at the center of the mass. Like a medical device? A pin or something from old surgery? No. Tom pointed at the screen. This shape. This is a bullet. The office went silent, except for the hum of the computer. Sarah's mind spun through implications. Her father had been in Vietnam, had come home with what the paperwork called minor wounds. There was a Purple Heart in a drawer somewhere, never displayed, never discussed. Suddenly it made terrible, perfect sense. From the war, she said, not a question. Margaret's face had gone pale. He never told me. Tom cleared his throat diplomatically. I'll give you a moment. But Sarah, he needs surgery, soon. The skin breakdown is just the beginning. This could rupture, cause massive infection, and with that bullet embedded. He trailed off, but they all knew what he meant. Sepsis. Death. They found James in the consultation room, dressed, sitting in a plastic chair that seemed too small for him. He looked older than he had that morning, smaller, like he'd been waiting 53 years for this moment, and now that it had arrived, he didn't know what to do with it. Tom was professional, gentle. He showed James the images, explained what they were seeing, the teratoma, the vascular system. Then, carefully, "Mr. Caldwell, there's something else." He brought up the image with the metallic object. James's face went blank. Not surprised, resigned, like watching a man who'd been holding his breath for decades finally exhale. He closed his eyes. A single tear tracked down his weathered cheek. "Dad?" Sarah's voice cracked. "Is that a bullet?" He nodded without opening his eyes. "From Vietnam?" Another nod. "How long have you known it was there?" James opened his eyes, met hers finally. "Since the day it happened." Tom asked the relevant questions. When was this? March 1969. Why wasn't it removed? Field hospital. Limited equipment. Too close to the spine. Standard protocol in combat zones. If the bullet wasn't causing immediate problems, extraction was riskier than leaving it. Over the decades, his body had tried to wall it off. Sometimes that worked, sometimes it triggered abnormal tissue growth. This was the sometimes. The bullet acted as a foreign body irritant, Tom explained. Over 50-plus years, cells accumulated around it, trying to encapsulate it. Developed into a teratoma, rare but documented. Now you've got both problems, the tumor and the bullet. Both need to come out. What if I say no? James's voice was steady. Tom met his eyes. Then you have maybe 2 to 3 weeks before the mass ruptures. Rupture means massive infection. In a man your age, probably fatal. Margaret made a small sound. Sarah reached for her mother's hand without thinking. The first physical contact they'd had in years that wasn't hello or goodbye. Sarah's medical voice took over, cold and clinical, because that was easier than feeling. The surgery is complex. We need to remove the mass and extract the bullet. The bullet's embedded, might have fragmented. Risk of spinal cord damage is 15 to 20%. Risk of death on the table is 8 to 10%. She paused, made herself say the rest. Risk of doing nothing is 100% fatal within a month. James absorbed this. Then, "If I don't make it through, don't," Sarah cut him off. "If I don't, there's something you both need to know. About how this happened. About why I never told anyone." Margaret's voice was quiet but firm. "Then tell us now. After, if I make it through." "No, now." James shook his head. "After the surgery." Sarah felt fury rise, hot and familiar. What if there is no after? Then it dies with me, like it should have 54 years ago. They stared at each other across the examination room. 10 years of silence and distance, and now this, him still keeping secrets, even as they tried to save his life. Margaret stepped between them, literal and metaphorical. To James, "You're having the surgery." To Sarah, "And you're going to perform it." Both started to object. "I've been quiet for 48 years, Margaret continued, her voice harder than either had heard before. "Not anymore." "James, you're getting this removed. Sarah, you're the best surgeon I know, and he needs the best. I don't want to hear arguments from either of you." The force of it stopped them both. Surgery was scheduled for the next morning. Too dangerous to wait longer, but not emergency enough for tonight. It gave them one night. James was admitted for pre-operative monitoring. Private room. Sarah had pulled strings again. Margaret refused to leave. Sarah went home to arrange for Benjamin's care, promising to return. That evening, James made a request. Asked Margaret to go back to the house, get something from the garage. Specific instructions. Locked metal box, top shelf, behind the paint cans. Key was in his wallet. Bring it here. Don't open it. Margaret drove his truck, something she hadn't done in years. The garage smelled like oil and sawdust and Old Spice aftershave. She found the box exactly where he'd said, small. Military issue, dented and rusted at the corners, heavier than it looked. Her fingers traced the lock. 48 years of wondering what he kept locked away. 48 years of learning not to ask. She almost opened it. Almost, but she didn't. Drove back to the hospital with the box sealed. Handed it to James without comment. "Thank you," he said, "for not looking. After 48 years, I figured you'd tell me when you're ready. I should have told you on day one." "Yes," Margaret said simply. "You should have." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't absolution, it was just honesty. Maybe for the first time. They sat in silence as evening deepened, talked about small things, Benjamin's school play, the neighbor's new dog, whether the roof would need replacing next spring. Avoiding the big things, because the big things were too big, too close, too real. At 10 p.m., Sarah returned with Benjamin. The boy was 12, tall and gangly, all elbows and curiosity. He hadn't seen his grandfather in 2 years. The greeting was awkward, stilted. But Benjamin broke through it, the way only children can. He sat at the foot of the hospital bed and asked simply, "Grandma says you were in a war. Were you brave?" James looked at his grandson for a long moment. "I survived. That's all." "That's kind of the same thing, isn't it?" "Maybe." James almost smiled. "Maybe it is." Benjamin's eyes drifted to the metal box on the bedside table. "What's in there?" Everyone looked at it. That small, dented repository of secrets. "History," James said. "Can I see?" "Someday. Not today." Benjamin accepted this with the easy grace of children who understand that "Maggie, if I don't wake up—" "Stop, please. Listen." He waited until she was quiet. "The box. Vietnam, March 1969. He was 18, barely, having lied about his age to enlist at 17. In the firefight, the squad split, half following Rodriguez toward safety, half following Morrison deeper into the kill zone. James was with Morrison's group, dragging wounded Tommy behind a fallen log, trying to stop the bleeding. Morrison panicked, fired wildly, not at the enemy, at shadows, at nothing. James watched Tommy Chen go down. Watched Morrison's rounds tear through his best friend. Friendly fire. Morrison didn't even realize. Rage overrode fear. James stood, shouted at Morrison to cease fire. Morrison spun toward him, weapon up. For a split second, James thought Morrison would shoot him too. James raised his own weapon, aimed at his commanding officer. In the middle of a firefight, they faced each other. Then Rodriguez appeared from the tree line, shot an enemy combatant behind Morrison, saved the lieutenant's life without knowing how close he'd come to dying by his own man's hand. In the chaos, James felt impact, his left shoulder, burning. He went down, couldn't tell where the shot came from. Front, back, side, all directions were firing. Medevac came. James loaded on the helicopter, fading in and out. Last thing he saw was Morrison's face, terror, guilt, and something else, recognition that James knew what had happened. Field hospital, doctors working. Bullet lodged near T4 vertebra, too risky to extract. Might cause paralysis, might be fatal. They left it in. Morrison visited, alone, leaned close. You didn't see what you think you saw. I saw you kill Chen. Crossfire happens in war. You weren't aiming at the enemy. Morrison's eyes went cold. You sayin' I shot you too, Private? James didn't answer. Didn't know if Morrison had shot him. I didn't think so, Morrison continued. You file a report, I'll file one too. Saying you panicked, froze, endangered the squad. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, prison. He paused. Oh, we both forget this. You get medical discharge. Go home. Your choice. James was 18, scared, and had no proof. Morrison was an officer. Who would believe an enlisted kid over West Point? He chose silence. Morrison left. James stayed in the hospital with a bullet in his back and a secret that would grow for 54 years. The operating room at Emory University Hospital was cold. Always cold. Sarah had performed hundreds of surgeries in rooms just like this. But standing here at 7 a.m., watching her father being positioned face down on the table, the cold felt different, personal. Dr. Tom Whitfield was lead surgeon, Sarah assisting. 5 others on the team. Anesthesiologist, 2 surgical nurses, a vascular specialist, a neurosurgeon on standby in case they damaged anything near the spine. This wasn't a routine excision. This was archaeology and demolition wrapped into one. He's under, the anesthesiologist confirmed. Tom made the first incision, 35 centimeters long, following the outline of the mass. Blood welled immediately. Sarah suctioned while Tom worked deeper, careful dissection through layers of tissue that had been stretched and distorted over decades. This thing has completely hijacked his vascular system, Tom murmured. It's got branches off the subclavian artery. We cut wrong. He bleeds out in minutes. Sarah's hands were steady. Had to be. She'd learned to partition herself in medical school, the part that felt and the part that worked. The part that worked was flawless. The part that felt was screaming. In the family waiting room, Margaret sat with the metal box in her lap, Benjamin beside her, reading a book he wasn't actually reading. The boy kept glancing at his grandmother, at the box, at the clock. 2 hours into surgery, 6 more to go if all went well. Margaret's fingers traced the box's edges. James had said, "If I don't wake up," had said, "Open it, read the letter inside." Past tense, present tense, the grammar of dying. "Grandma?" Benjamin's voice was quiet. "Are you okay?" She wasn't, but she said, "Yes, honey." "Are you going to open it?" Margaret looked at the box. 48 years of marriage to a man who kept parts of himself locked away. 48 years of respecting that, of not pushing, of waiting for him to be ready. What if he never woke up? What if the answers died with him? "I don't know," she said honestly. Then, making a decision, "Yes, I am." The key was in her purse, James's wallet, the small brass key he'd told her about. Her hands shook as she fitted into the lock. Benjamin watched, solemn and curious. Inside, a Purple Heart medal. She'd known about that one, had seen it once, decades ago. Dog tags, expected. A stack of letters, yellowed with age. And on top, one envelope. Different paper. Sealed. Never opened. The address made her breath catch. PFC, James Caldwell. Return address, Lieutenant David Morrison. Postmarked April 1969. 54 years ago. "Aren't you going to open it?" Benjamin asked. Margaret stared at the envelope. Morrison. That name had come up exactly once in 48 years, whispered in James's sleep during a nightmare. She'd asked about it the next morning. He'd said, "Just someone from the war," and never mentioned it again. She opened the envelope carefully, unfolding the letter inside. Handwriting rushed, barely legible. Dated April 15th, 1969. She began to read. In the operating room, they were 2 hours in. The tumor was being separated from surrounding tissue, a painstaking process of cutting adhesions that had formed over decades. Blood loss was moderate but controlled. The cardiac monitor beeped steadily. Beep, beep, beep. Tom reached the deeper layers. "I see the bullet. Looks intact." Sarah leaned in. There it was. A small piece of brass, dark with age, embedded in the center of the tumor, like a pearl in an oyster. This piece of metal had shaped her father's entire life, had shaped hers by extension. "How close to the spine?" Tom asked. Sarah checked the angle. "Too close. 2 millimeters, maybe 3. "Christ." Tom adjusted his position. "Okay. We need to extract the tumor first, then carefully remove the bullet. Can't just pull it. Might be fragmented." They worked in silence, the only sounds the beep of monitors and the quiet instructions between surgical team members. Sarah had trained herself not to think during surgery, to let muscle memory and knowledge take over. But her mind kept drifting to the man on the table, to the father who'd missed her wedding, to all the years of silence, to the question she'd never asked. Why? Margaret finished reading the letter once, then read it again. Then a third time. Her hands were shaking, tears streaming down her face. Benjamin watched, worried. "Grandma? What's wrong?" She couldn't speak. The letter, Morrison's confession, his apology, his revelation that he hadn't shot James, that he'd planned to confess everything, that he'd died the next day never knowing if James would ever read these words. James had carried this letter for 54 years, sealed, never opened. Why? What had he been afraid of finding, or had he known what was inside and simply couldn't face it? "Grandma?" Benjamin touched her arm. "It's okay, honey," she managed. "It's just... your grandfather has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. And I'm just now understanding how heavy. In the OR, hour 4, the tumor was almost completely removed, sitting in a specimen container like some grotesque prize. The bullet was exposed now, visible in the surgical field. Tom had the forceps ready. "Careful now," he murmured to himself. "Steady." He gripped the bullet, began to pull. Resistance. "It's not coming," Sarah said, watching the monitors for any sign of distress. Tom tried again, gentler. More resistance. He stopped. "It's not intact." "There are fragments." The room tensed. Fragmented bullets were exponentially more dangerous. Each piece could be embedded in different tissue, each one a potential disaster if pulled wrong. Tom carefully probed around the visible bullet. "I count. Sarah, I need your eyes. How many fragments do you see?" Sarah leaned in, studying the field. "At least 4, maybe more deeper in." "Okay, we need to extract each one individually. This is going to take time. Time they might not have." As Tom worked on the first fragment, carefully dissecting it free from surrounding tissue, the anesthesiologist called out, "We've got a bleeder." Arterial. Sarah's heart jumped. "Where?" "Small artery, near the extraction site. BP dropping, 90/60. Sarah moved fast, suction in one hand, cautery in the other. Found the bleeder, a small vessel that had been compressed by the bullet fragment for decades, now suddenly open and spurting. She clamped it, cauterized, sutured. 2 minutes that felt like 20. "BP stabilizing," the anesthesiologist confirmed. 110/70. Tom looked at Sarah over his mask. "Nice work." She nodded, didn't trust herself to speak. They continued, fragment by fragment, each one embedded, each one dangerous. The largest was 1.5 centimeters, the smallest barely 2 millimeters. 7 pieces total. The bullet had disintegrated on impact 54 years ago, and James had been walking around with shrapnel embedded near his spine ever since. Hour 6. The last fragment was the deepest. It was touching the dura mater, the tough membrane covering the spinal cord. One wrong move, and James would wake up paralyzed. If he woke up at all. "I need complete stillness," Tom said quietly. "Sarah, suction here. Not too much pressure. Just enough to see." She positioned the suction exactly where he indicated. Her hands were steady despite everything. Years of training, hundreds of surgeries, all leading to this moment. Tom used micro-forceps, the smallest they had, touched the fragment, tested resistance. "It's not embedded in the dura. It's just resting against it." "Can you extract it?" Sarah asked. "I think so." He adjusted his grip infinitesimally. "But this is the moment. If it slips, if I pull wrong—" He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The room was silent, except for the monitors. Tom took a breath. Pulled. Slowly. Steadily. The fragment came free. "Clear," he said, holding it up to the light. Collective exhale from everyone in the room. "All fragments in the specimen container," Tom confirmed. "Tumor removed. No active bleeding. Vitals stable." They began closing, layer by layer, stitching James Caldwell back together. Sarah placed the final sutures in the skin, her hands moving through familiar motions while her mind raced ahead to recovery, to complications, to whether he'd wake up whole or broken. "Good work, everyone," Tom said as they finished. "Now we wait." James was moved to ICU recovery, still intubated, still heavily sedated. The ventilator breathed for him. Whoosh, click, whoosh, click. Mechanical life. Sarah found Margaret and Benjamin in the waiting room. Her scrubs were still on, spotted with her father's blood. Margaret stood immediately. "How is he?" "Surgery went well," Sarah said, exhaustion hitting her suddenly. "We got everything out, all the tumor, all the bullet fragments." She saw the relief start to form on her mother's face. Then, But he lost a lot of blood, and the area around his spine. There was inflammation, damage from decades of that thing pressing on nerves. We won't know the extent until he wakes up." "What does that mean?" Margaret's voice was carefully controlled. Sarah chose honesty. "Could be fine. Could have nerve damage. Could have partial paralysis. Could not wake up at all. The next 24 hours are critical." Margaret sat down heavily. Benjamin moved to her side, put his arm around her. 12 years old, and trying to be the strong one. Sarah sat on Margaret's other side. Mother and daughter separated by years of hurt and pride, united by fear. Margaret handed Sarah the letter. "I opened the box. I know I shouldn't have. But read this." Sarah took the letter, confused. "Read it." Her face changed with every line. "This is from his commanding officer?" she asked when she finished. "Who died the next day, apparently." "And Dad never opened it?" Envelope was sealed. "For 54 years?" Margaret nodded. "So he's been thinking," Sarah couldn't finish, "that his lieutenant shot him and threatened him," Margaret completed, "when actually—" Morrison confessed and apologized. They sat in stunned silence. The magnitude of it. 54 years of believing a lie. 54 years of carrying guilt and anger and betrayal that had been unnecessary. If he'd just opened the letter, if he'd just asked, if he'd just trusted someone enough to share the burden. "Why didn't he open it?" Sarah whispered. "I don't know," Margaret said. "Maybe he needed someone to blame. Maybe the truth was scarier than the lie." Benjamin looked between them. "Is Grandpa going to be okay?" Neither woman could answer. They took turns at his bedside. Maggie held his hand, talked to him. Nurses said hearing was the last sense to go, first to return. She told him about the letter, about Morrison's confession, begged him to wake up. Sarah and Benjamin sat in the cafeteria at 3 a.m., both unable to sleep. Benjamin asked, "Is Grandpa going to die?" Sarah wanted to give him doctor answers, statistics, careful qualifications. Instead, "I don't know, honey." "You're a doctor?" "You're supposed to know." "Being a doctor doesn't mean I have all the answers." "Especially when it's someone you love." Benjamin looked at her. "Do you love him? You never see him." The question gutted her. "Yes, I love him. That's why I haven't seen him." "That doesn't make sense. Sometimes we avoid the people we love most because they hurt us most." Benjamin considered this. "That's pretty stupid." Despite everything, Sarah laughed. "Yeah, it really is." Hour 10, post-surgery. James should have been waking up by now. The sedation had been reduced. The ventilator removed. He was breathing on his own, at least. But his eyes stayed closed. His hand didn't squeeze back when Margaret held it. The monitors showed brain activity, but minimal response to stimuli. The neurologist came in at dawn. Dr. Patricia Chen, no relation to the Tommy Chen who died in James's arms 54 years ago. But Sarah noticed her father's lips move when the doctor introduced herself. Even unconscious, that name reached him. Dr. Chen ran tests. Pupil response, sluggish. Reflex checks, diminished. She withdrew blood for labs, checked the monitors, made notes on her tablet. Her face gave nothing away, but Sarah had been a doctor long enough to read the subtle signs. The slight tightening around the eyes, the way she double-checked results. "We need to do an EEG," Dr. Chen said finally. "Check brain activity patterns more closely." Margaret's voice was steady. What are you looking for? Making sure there's no significant neurological damage from the surgery. Blood loss, oxygen deprivation, any number of complications can affect brain function. The unspoken words hung in the sterile air. Brain damage, vegetative state, never waking up. They did the EEG in the ICU, didn't want to risk moving him. Electrodes placed on his scalp, wires running to the machine. The readout showed waves and peaks that meant nothing to Margaret, everything to Sarah. Activity is there, Dr. Chen said, which should have been reassuring. But the response to external stimuli is concerning. He should be more reactive by now. What does that mean? Margaret asked, though she didn't want to hear the answer. It means we wait. Sometimes the body needs more time. Sometimes. Dr. Chen didn't finish. Didn't need to. Margaret broke in the hospital chapel. Found it by accident, looking for a bathroom on the second floor. Saw the small room with its simple cross and rows of chairs. She'd been holding herself together for 16 hours. Holding it together for Sarah, for Benjamin, for the nursing staff who kept asking if she needed anything. She didn't need anything. She needed James to wake up. The tears came hard, silent, her whole body shaking with them. 48 years of marriage. 48 years of sleeping beside a man who kept parts of himself locked away. She'd accepted it, adapted to it, built a life around the spaces he wouldn't fill. But she'd never stopped loving him. That was the terrible truth. Even when he was absent, even when he chose distance, even when she knew he was hiding something that hurt him, she loved him. Had loved him since 1975 when he'd come into the VA hospital for physical therapy. Broken and silent and trying so hard to pretend he wasn't. I should have made him go to the doctor years ago, she whispered to the empty room. I knew something was wrong. I knew. The door opened. Sarah stood there, looking as wrecked as Margaret felt. Mom? Margaret wiped her face. I'm fine. You're not. Sarah came in, sat in the chair beside her mother. Neither am I. They sat in silence. Then Sarah said, This isn't your fault. I was a nurse. I should have seen. He's a stubborn man. Always has been. You couldn't have made him do anything he didn't want to do. I could have tried harder. You spent 48 years trying. Sarah's voice cracked. Some people are determined to carry things alone, even when it kills them. Margaret looked at her daughter, really looked. Sarah's eyes were red, exhausted. Her hair, usually perfect, was pulled back in a messy ponytail. The surgeon who'd performed flawless procedures was just a daughter now, scared and small. Why did he do this? Sarah asked suddenly. Why did he hide it for 40 years? He could have had it removed decades ago, before it got this bad, before it almost killed him. He was afraid. Of surgery? Everyone's afraid of surgery. Of being weak. Of being broken. Margaret paused. Of being seen. That's ridiculous. Is it? Margaret turned to face Sarah fully. Look at yourself. Sarah blinked. What? You've avoided him for 10 years because he hurt you, disappointed you. You hid from him, just like he hid from everyone else. That's different. Is it? Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. Your father came home from war broken. Not just physically, soul broken. He watched friends die. thought his commanding officer betrayed him, shot him, threatened him into silence. Then had to live with that, alone, for 54 years. You think it's easy to ask for help after that? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. I didn't think about it that way. Men of his generation, they don't talk. They carry things. Your father carried a bullet, and a war, and guilt, and shame. And he did it, so we wouldn't have to. Why didn't he open the letter? Sarah asked. If he'd opened it, he'd have known Morrison didn't betray him. He'd have known the truth. Margaret considered this. Maybe he needed someone to blame. Maybe Morrison being alive and guilty was easier than Morrison being dead and sorry. That doesn't make sense. Grief doesn't make sense. Neither does survivor's guilt. Your father survived when his friends didn't. Maybe carrying that blame was his penance. Before Sarah could respond, an alarm sounded from the direction of the ICU. They both knew that sound. Code alarm. They ran. Arrived at James's room to find the crash team assembling. The monitor showed cardiac arrhythmia, his heart rhythm irregular, dangerous. The numbers dropping, blood pressure falling, oxygen saturation declining. A nurse tried to usher them out. You need to step out. No! Margaret's voice was sharp. Sarah pulled her mother back anyway. Let them work, Mom. Let them work. Through the window, they watched. Chest compressions. The doctor counting 1, 2, 3. Defibrillator paddles charged. Clear! James's body jerked with the shock. Monitor still showed irregular rhythm. Again. Clear! Another shock. Margaret was praying. She hadn't prayed in years, not really, but the words came back from childhood. Please, God, please. Sarah was praying too, though she didn't realize it until she heard herself whispering, Don't take him. Not yet. Not like this. Benjamin appeared, running down the hall with a nurse chasing him. He'd been in the cafeteria, saw the code team rushing past. He knew what it meant. Stood beside his mother and grandmother, watching his grandfather die. Third shock. Clear! The monitor beeped. Once, twice, found a rhythm. Steady. Weak, but steady. We got him back, the doctor announced. The team continued working, medications, adjustments, stabilization. 15 minutes before they allowed the family back in. James looked smaller than before. The ventilator was back, breathing for him again. New 4 lines, new monitors, new medications running into his veins. His skin was gray, his lips slightly blue despite the oxygen. The doctor, young and exhausted, spoke quietly. His heart stopped for approximately 90 seconds. We got him back, but there may be additional complications from the oxygen deprivation. The next few hours are critical. What he didn't say, this might happen again. Next time, they might not get him back. Margaret took James's hand. It was cold. She rubbed it between her palms, trying to warm it, trying to pull him back from wherever he'd gone. James, she whispered, you come back to me. You hear me? 48 years together. You don't get to leave like this. You wake up. You wake up, and you tell me everything you should have told me 50 years ago. No response, just the ventilator. Whoosh, click, whoosh, click. Sarah stood at the foot of the bed, watching the monitors. The surgeon in her cataloging every number, every trend, every implication. The daughter in her watching her father slip away despite everything she'd learned, everything she could do. Benjamin squeezed between them, took his grandfather's other hand. Grandpa, he said simply, please wake up. I want to hear about the war. You promised. The monitor beeped. The ventilator breathed. The sun rose outside the window, and James Caldwell remained suspended between two worlds, carrying his secrets into the dark. Hour 14, post-surgery. The cardiac event had stabilized, but James remained unconscious. The family kept vigil in shifts, Margaret refusing to leave the bedside, Sarah reviewing his charts obsessively, Benjamin curled in a chair pretending to do homework. Then, at 2:30 in the afternoon, James's fingers twitched. Margaret felt it first. She'd been holding his hand for hours, and suddenly, movement. Small, but unmistakable. "James?" His eyes moved beneath closed lids. REM sleep. Dreaming. The nurse came over immediately. "That's good. Means brain activity. Very good." Margaret leaned close. His lips were moving, forming words without sound. She pressed her ear near his mouth, straining to hear. "Tommy," he whispered. Then again clearer. "Tommy." "I'm sorry." Sarah checked the old military records from the metal box. Thomas Chen died March 23, 1969. Same day Dad was wounded. James continued murmuring, names cycling through like a roll call of the dead. Rodriguez. Morrison. Should have opened it. Morrison. I should have. Even unconscious, the guilt persisted. Even in dreams, he carried them all. At hour 16, his eyes opened. Confusion first. White ceiling, fluorescent lights, the chemical smell of hospital. For a disoriented moment, James was 18 again, waking in a field hospital in Vietnam, morphine-hazed and terrified. Then Margaret's voice, an anchor in the chaos. "James! James, look at me!" He turned his head. He could move, thank God he could move, and saw her face, older than in his dream. 70 years old, not the 22-year-old nurse he'd fallen in love with. Reality snapped into place. He was 72. He was home. He'd survived. "Maggie?" His voice was raw from the breathing tube. She was crying and smiling simultaneously. "I'm here." Did I? He couldn't finish the question. "You made it." Surgery was successful. He tried to reach behind himself, test if the mass was gone. Margaret caught his hand gently. "Don't move yet." But yes, it's gone, all of it. Relief so profound it felt like pain. "The bullet?" Sarah stepped forward from where she'd been standing by the monitors. "All 7 pieces, gone." He focused on her, surprised. "Sarah, you did the surgery?" She nodded, tears in her eyes. "Thank you." The words felt inadequate. First time he'd thanked her for anything in years, maybe ever. Sarah broke, leaning on the bed rail, sobbing. James, weak but certain, put his hand on her head. The gesture awkward, unpracticed, but real. "I'm sorry," he said, "for everything, for all of it." Margaret needed to tell him, couldn't wait. "James, there's something you need to know." "About Morrison?" "I know. I killed him with my silence." "No. You need to hear this." She exchanged glances with Sarah. "I opened the box. Read the letter." Alarm crossed his face. "You weren't supposed to, I know. But I did. And you need to hear what it says." "I don't want to know what he wrote. It doesn't matter anymore." "Why not?" Margaret asked, gently. "Because it doesn't change anything. He shot me. He shot Chen. He threatened me. A letter won't change that." Sarah spoke up. "Dad, Morrison didn't shoot you." James's face hardened with 54 years of certainty. "Yes, he did." "No. Read the letter." Sarah held it out. "I don't need to." "James Edward Caldwell." Margaret's voice had that tone that meant business. "I've been patient for 48 years. You're reading this letter." She took it from Sarah, the envelope already opened, and held it toward him. James looked at it like it might explode. "What does it say?" "You need to hear it yourself." Sarah began reading aloud, every word, slowly. Morrison's confession, killing Chen in panic, friendly fire, filing false reports, his revelation. "But James, I didn't shoot you. My weapon was checked, only one round matched to a friendly casualty. Chen." James's eyes closed, his hands gripped the sheets. Sarah continued, "Morrison's guilt. I let you think the bullet in your back came from me. I saw the fear in your eyes. I let it stay there. His plan to confess, his apology, his death the next day." When Sarah finished, silence filled the room. James's breathing had quickened. One tear tracked down his weathered face. "When was this dated?" His voice broke. "April 15th, 1969. Day before the ambush." James opened his eyes, staring at nothing. "Day before Morrison died. He wrote this, knowing he might not come back." "And he didn't," Margaret confirmed softly. "He was going to confess. Was going to face court-martial. Was going to clear my name." James's voice was hollow. "And I never knew." "Because you never opened the letter," Sarah said. The question hung there, unasked, but palpable. James finally addressed it. "I was afraid." "Of what?" Sarah leaned forward. "Of forgiveness." He met her eyes. "If Morrison apologized, I'd have to forgive him. And I didn't want to. I wanted someone to blame. For Tommy, for all of it. I needed someone to be the villain, so I wasn't." The confession settled over them. 54 years of anger, and it had been a choice all along. A way to externalize guilt he couldn't bear to own. But there was more. James could feel it building, the secret beneath the secret, the truth he'd never told anyone because it made him a monster. "There's more," he said quietly. "Something I've never told anyone." Margaret took his hand. "Tell us now." James gathered courage from somewhere deep. 54 years of silence. Time to break it. That day in the jungle, Morrison did kill Chen. Friendly fire, panic, wrong target. I saw it happen. And in that moment, I wanted to kill Morrison. I raised my weapon. I aimed at my commanding officer. Sarah's breath caught. "Did you shoot?" "I don't know." The 3 words he'd lived with. That's the truth I've carried. I pulled my trigger. Someone shot me in the back at the same moment, spun me around, I went down. Never knew if my bullet hit Morrison or not. The room went still. Later, in the hospital, Morrison came. Threatened me about Chen, but he also looked afraid. Not of me reporting Chen's death, afraid of something else. I thought, he knows I shot at him. He's going to report me for attempted murder of an officer, death penalty offense in wartime. So the deal, Sarah said slowly, understanding, wasn't just about Chen. It was mutual silence. I don't report his killing Chen. He doesn't report my trying to kill him. Both of us guilty, both of us trapped. But Dad? Sarah pulled up records on her tablet, something she'd researched during the long surgical hours. Morrison died the next day from enemy fire, different engagement. I requested his medical records. He was treated for minor shrapnel wounds on March 23rd, your date, but no bullet wounds. James stared at her. What? Your bullet missed. You didn't hit him. The words didn't compute at first. 54 years of believing he was a would-be murderer. 54 years of carrying that specific guilt, that specific shame. And it wasn't even true? I missed? Something between a laugh and a sob escaped him. You missed, Sarah confirmed. James started laughing, crying, both. The sound was broken and healing simultaneously. 54 years thinking I'm a murderer. And I missed? You're not a murderer, James, Margaret said firmly. But I wanted to be. Intended to be. You were in combat, Sarah countered. Your friend had just died in front of you. You reacted. That's human, not murder. Wanting and doing are different, Margaret added. You pulled a trigger in the heat of combat. Morrison pulled a trigger and killed someone. Those aren't the same thing. James absorbed this. 2 revelations. Morrison hadn't betrayed him after all, and he hadn't killed Morrison. 54 years of guilt, built on misunderstanding and silence and fear. Why? He whispered. Why didn't I just open the letter? You tell us, Sarah said gently. I think, James struggled for words, I think I needed the anger. Needed someone to hate so I didn't have to hate myself. If Morrison was the villain, then I was just the victim. But if he was sorry, if he was trying to make it right, then I had to face what I'd done, what I'd tried to do. What you tried to do was defend your friend, Margaret said. What you tried to do was stop someone from killing your unit. Those are brave things, not evil things. I aimed at my commanding officer, who was killing his own men through incompetence, Sarah interrupted. Dad, you were 18. 18. Tommy had just died. You reacted. Any court-martial board would have understood that. Maybe. James didn't sound convinced. Then, Morrison said in the letter he was going to confess. Was going to face court-martial. He was 25, had everything to lose, and he was going to do the right thing. He was braver than I was. He died the next day, Margaret said softly. Never got the chance. Because he was trying to redeem himself, James realized. The mission, I remember now. Rodriguez tried to get it canceled, said the intelligence was bad. Morrison overruled him. Morrison went on a suicide mission because he wanted to die bravely, instead of living with shame. Sarah checked the records again. He died saving 3 men trapped in an ambush, got them out, then went back for their weapons, took enemy fire covering their retreat. He didn't want to go to prison, James said. He wanted to die a hero. Clear his name the only way he knew how. They sat with that. Morrison's choice, James's choice. 2 young men in an impossible situation, both choosing differently, both paying the price. So what now? Sarah asked. What do you do with this? James looked at his daughter, really looked at her. She was 44. He'd missed so much of her life. Benjamin was 12. How many years had he missed there? I tell the truth, he said finally. Maybe not all of it. Not publicly. Some things stay with the people who are there. But to you, to both of you, No more secrets. No more locked boxes. "Starting when?" Margaret asked. James squeezed her hand. "Starting now. Starting with this. I love you. Both of you. And I'm sorry I made you wait 54 years to hear it." Sarah started crying again. Margaret pulled her close. James reached for them both, pulling his family into an awkward hospital bed embrace. The healing had started. Not complete. Healing never was, but started. Outside the window, the sun was setting over Atlanta. Inside the ICU room, a family was being born again. Recovery came slowly. James improved day by day, sitting up unsupported on day 2, walking with assistance on day 3. Physical therapy was intensive. His back was healing well, the long surgical scar pink and clean along his shoulder blade. The absence of the mass was strange, disorienting. For 40 years he'd carried that weight. Now his body didn't know what to do with the lightness. There was no paralysis, no nerve damage beyond some temporary tingling that the doctors assured him would fade. Given the location, the duration, the complexity of the surgery, it was miraculous. Tom Whitfield said as much when he did the final check before discharge. "You're one lucky man, Mr. Caldwell." James thought about luck, about Morrison's letter sitting unread for 54 years, about a bullet that had missed its target, about surviving when Tommy and so many others hadn't. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe just stubborn." The conversations with Margaret came in waves. Long talks filling in 48 years of silence. James told her about Vietnam. Not all of it, some things were still too raw, but more than he'd ever shared. The heat, the fear, watching boys become men, become casualties in the span of heartbeats. The impossible choices, the weight of survival. Margaret shared too. Her own stories from being an Army nurse, the trauma she'd carried, the wounded men she couldn't save. Two people who'd both brought war home, both dealt with it in silence, both alone when they could have been together. "I wish you'd told me," she said one evening, sitting beside his hospital bed. "I wish I'd known how. We could have learned together." "Yeah," James agreed quietly. "We could have." With Sarah, it was harder. 10 years of distance couldn't be erased in a week. But they were trying. She visited daily, sometimes as his doctor, increasingly as his daughter. Brought Benjamin, who was fascinated by the medical equipment and asked 100 questions James found himself actually wanting to answer. One afternoon, Benjamin asked the question directly. "Grandpa, what happened in the war?" Sarah started to intervene. Some things weren't for 12-year-old ears, but James stopped her with a look. "I'll tell you," he said to Benjamin, "when you're older. Not all of it, but the parts that matter. I promise." "You promise?" Benjamin's eyes were serious. "I promise." Benjamin accepted this, satisfied. A promise from his grandfather meant something now. That was new. That was worth everything. On day 7, James was discharged. Sarah drove them home, Margaret in the passenger seat, James and Benjamin in back. The same configuration as the terrifying drive to Atlanta. But everything was different now. James wore a short-sleeved shirt, first time in public with scars visible. The surgical scar was obvious, impossible to hide. Older scars, too, shrapnel marks, the faded remains of 54 years of hidden history. He didn't care who saw anymore. The house on Oakwood Drive looked the same, but James felt different entering it. Margaret had made cornbread that morning before they left for the hospital. The smell filled the house, warm and welcoming, and home. James asked to go to the garage. Everyone worried you should rest, but he insisted. Sarah helped him out back, steadying him as they crossed the yard. He opened the garage door. Workbench, tools, the detritus of 40 years of hiding. The metal box was gone, still at the hospital with Margaret's things. But its absence was loud. The shrine he'd built to secrets he could finally name. James turned on the old radio on the workbench. By chance or fate, Paint It Black was playing. The Rolling Stones, 1966. The song that had been playing the night Morrison died. For 50 years, James had turned it off whenever he heard it. Couldn't bear the memories it carried. This time, he let it play. Sarah watched him, ready to intervene if needed. But he just stood there, listening, letting the memories come without fighting them. It was still hard, still hurt, but he didn't run from it. When the song ended, he turned to Sarah. "Thank you for saving my life." "You already thanked me." "I mean it this time. Really mean it." She hugged him carefully, mindful of his healing back. "You're welcome."
"But you have to promise me something."
"What?"
"No more secrets. No more hiding. If something's wrong, anything, you tell us."
"I promise." "Because I can't lose you again, Dad. I just got you back." James held his daughter and realized he was crying. Open, honest tears, not hidden in darkness or garage solitude, but in daylight with witness. It felt like shedding skin. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from Veterans Affairs. Someone had found Morrison's confession in archived records. James had given permission for the files to be reviewed. The VA wanted to do something to honor the truth that had taken so long to surface. Veterans Day fell in early November. Marietta held its annual ceremony in the town square. James hadn't attended in 40 years. This year, Benjamin and Sarah convinced him to go. The square was decorated with flags and bunting. Veterans from every era: Korea, Vietnam, Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan. Men and women from their 20s to their 80s. James sat with the other Vietnam veterans, first time in over 50 years. First time he'd let himself be part of that community. The VA representative spoke about James. Not all the details, some things remained private, but about the bullet carried for 54 years, about surgical miracles and the wounds that don't show, about every veteran who carries invisible weight. Then they presented him with Morrison's Purple Heart. The Morrison family had been located, had wanted James to have it. Also, a framed copy of the letter, and Morrison's name added to the local memorial wall. For honoring those who tried to do right, even when they failed, the representative said. James was asked to say a few words. He hadn't prepared anything, hadn't public spoken since 1970. He stood slowly, Sarah ready to catch him if needed. He was okay. "I'm not a hero," he began, voice carrying in the quiet square. "Heroes are the ones who didn't come home, like Lieutenant David Morrison, like Tommy Chan, like so many others whose names are on these walls." He paused, gathering words. "But I'm learning something." Surviving is its own kind of courage. Asking for help is its own kind of strength. And telling the truth, even 54 years late, his voice cracked, is its own kind of freedom. He sat down to applause. Several older veterans were crying. They understood. The weight of coming home. The weight of staying alive when others didn't. the guilt that never quite left. After the ceremony, an older man approached, Hispanic, early 70s, walking with a cane. He looked at James for a long moment, then, "Caldwell? James Caldwell?" James studied the face, pulled from memory. "Rodriguez?" They embraced, two old soldiers who'd survived the same war, the same day, the same impossible choices. They'd lost contact after 1970. Rodriguez had tried to reach out once or twice, but James had been too deep in his silence. "You look good, man," Rodriguez said. "I'm lighter," James replied. Rodriguez understood without explanation. They talked, Morrison, Tommy, the old days. Rodriguez said, "Morrison talked about you after that day." "What'd he say?" "Said you were the only one brave enough to challenge him. Said he wished he'd listened." James processed this. "He apologized in the letter." "Good. He should have." They exchanged numbers, promised to stay in touch this time.
Rodriguez limped away, leaning on his cane, carrying his own invisible weight. Thanksgiving came 2 weeks later. The Caldwell house filled with people for the first time in years. Margaret, James, Sarah, Benjamin. Sarah's ex-husband came too. They were talking again, co-parenting better, maybe finding friendship in the wreckage of their marriage. 2 elderly neighbors who'd been Margaret's friends through the long years, and Rodriguez, surprise guest, driving up from Florida. The table was full, cornbread and turkey and all the traditional dishes. "You Send Me" played on the radio, Margaret's choice. James smiled at it instead of flinching. Benjamin asked to say grace. Everyone was surprised. Kid's idea. Nobody had prompted it. He folded his hands, said simply, "Thank you for Grandpa being alive, and for doctors, and for letters that tell the truth. Amen." "Amen," everyone echoed. After dinner, the men gathered in the garage. Tradition, Margaret said, shooing them out while the women cleaned up. Rodriguez and James stood by the workbench, decades falling away. "You ever think about them?" Rodriguez asked. "Morrison, Chen, the others?" "Every day. For 54 years. "Me too." Rodriguez was quiet. "Morrison went back for those men, you know, the day he died. Didn't have to. Could have stayed safe. He went back, trying to redeem himself. Maybe. Or maybe just doing what needed doing." Rodriguez looked at James. "That's the thing about war. There's no heroes or villains, just people making impossible choices and living with the consequences. Or not living with them. Or not living with them," Rodriguez agreed. They stood in comfortable silence, 2 old soldiers who'd earned the right to quietness. Inside, Sarah and Margaret did dishes. Benjamin showed his father a comic book. Rodriguez and James talked about old battles and new grandchildren, and the price of living long enough to have both memories and hope. Later, when everyone had gone and the house was quiet, Maggie and James sat on the front porch. November air was cool but not cold. James wore a light jacket, still getting used to the feeling of air on his back, even through fabric. Margaret took his hand. "You okay?" James thought about it. Really thought. "Yeah. For the first time in 54 years, I think I am." "Good." She squeezed his hand. They sat watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. From inside, the radio played. "You Send Me" came on again. Margaret's station cycled through the same songs. James didn't flinch at the sound, didn't retreat to the garage, didn't build walls. He just squeezed his wife's hand and watched the stars, and felt the absence of weight that had defined him for so long. Finally home. In every sense of the word. The bullet was gone, the tumor was gone, the secrets were gone. What remained was harder and more valuable. Truth, family, and the courage to face both. James Caldwell had spent 54 years carrying war in his body. Now at 72, he was learning to carry peace instead. It wasn't easy. Healing never was. But it was possible. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, that felt like enough. Sometimes the heaviest things we carry aren't on our bodies, they're buried deep in our hearts. James Caldwell carried a bullet for 54 years, but the real weight was the silence, the secrets, the belief that asking for help meant weakness. How many of us have done the same? Hidden our pain behind long sleeves and locked doors, convinced that showing our scars would make us less than we are. But here's what James learned on that hospital bed. Surrounded by the family he'd pushed away. Vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the bridge back to the people we love. His daughter performed the surgery that saved his life, but it was truth that set him free. The letter he'd been too afraid to open for half a century held forgiveness he'd denied himself. We spend so much time being strong, being silent, being self-sufficient, and we miss the healing that comes from simply saying, "I need help." James got his freedom at 72. You don't have to wait that long. What secret weight are you carrying? What letter have you been afraid to open? Share your story in the comments below. Sometimes the first step to healing is simply saying the words out loud.